Hello guys, let's talk about the bishops. With the bishops we have a little bit different fight, but generally it's pretty simple if you understand some of the basic ideas. First of all, the bishops can be divided into two parts, the same color bishops and the opposite color square bishops. We start with the same color square bishops. And now, what are the ways that we can defend at such endgames? Because if we just understand these ways, it's going to be a way easier to get into the winning ideas. And now, let's get started. First idea is to simply capture the pawn, because if we capture the pawn, the endgame is drawn, because the opponent cannot win having king and bishop against the bishop or against just the bare king. The second idea is to have the same stuff, but this time we are just blocking the pawn from advancing forward, and after that just getting the bishop sacrificed for the pawn, and even if the pawn recaptures, it's still a draw. It is the automatic draw. Because we capture the pawn, king bishop against the king, it's a draw. The third idea is the idea that we are capturing the pawn, but not by blocking the pawn with the king, but due to the pin along the diagonal. This way, the pawn cannot move forward because the bishop is pinning the pawn. After the king step back from the pin with the idea of putting the pawn onto the dark square and attacking the king, we capture the pawn and the game immediately ends in a draw. Another idea would be if the king is in the different color than the bishop, because the bishop cannot chase away the king, and at the same time in the path of the pawn. What is this idea? We can just simply step back with the bishop, and we are just controlling the square. The pawn will be passing by. At this moment, it is the square c6 and the promotion square c8. At this moment, as long as the pawn cannot get into c6, it cannot reach the promoting square as well. Therefore, we are going back and forth over the same diagonal. If the opponent doesn't want to trade the bishops or doesn't make any other stuff, take notice that the king is on the opposite color square than the bishop. The king itself cannot push back the king because the king cannot touch each other. And now at this moment the game ends in a draw. Another idea, if we are just having the stuff mentioned previously, if the king is having the place in front of the pawn, and now we are just going with the bishops and we are doing nothing. We are just waiting for our opponent. If the opponent doesn't do anything, we are just drawing easily, especially as we have the pawn on the edge of the board. And the pawn on the edge of the board, so-called the rook's pawn, is the easiest to defend. Therefore, one of the ideas is just to stay in the king on the opposite square than the bishop in front of the pawn, and now at this moment the opponent cannot do anything that can improve his position. And the last idea is the idea that we are getting into the pawn endgames. If you know, if the pawn endgame is of course drawn, and now at this moment, as we can see, the bishop is pinning our bishop, we are stepping back, and after the opponent decides to trade the bishop, the endgame is drawn. Of course, the endgame is drawn, as you can see with the pawn endgame videos on my channel that you can watch if you wish. And this is one of the simplest set of the ideas, and you can, let's say, review them one by one. And after that, we are getting into some of the endgames to show you how the endgames can be won or drawn from both sides, and I'll just explain all of these ideas. And now we have the first position. What's going on here? One of the ideas, if we'd like to win the bishop and pawn versus the bishop, is the idea about the interference. If the opponent's bishop cannot control the promoting square, sacrificing itself, then we are going to win the position. For example, if black is on the move, they are just interfering the promoting square with their own bishop. If the opponent captures, we recapture, and the next move is the promotion, and now black wins. And that's why one of the easiest way is to interference the control of the bishop, because if the bishop doesn't control the promoting square, then we are promoting the pawn without the bishop sacrificing itself for the pawn. And now the first idea. Now what would happen if this position will play out with white? As you probably see previously, the bishop just interfered the opponent's bishop on g2. Take notice that this bishop was protected by the king, but what happens if we just control this square with our king? Take notice, at this moment, white controls the g2 square twice, black controls the g2 squares twice. If I put the bishop on g2, of course, white captures, black cannot recapture, and at the same time having the square of the promotion controlled, it is an easy draw. Of course, black will be trying to make some of the tricks. For example, one of the tricks is the deflection. After capturing, of course, black is winning, but as long as the bishop will be controlling the diagonal, not getting out of this diagonal and not plundering the bishop for anything except the pawn promotion, the game ends in a draw. Another position is whenever the pawn is on the 7th rank. If the pawn is on the 7th rank, there are some ideas that we need to take into account. First of this idea is the setup of the king. If our king is in front of the pawn in one of these three squares, if we are the stronger sides, we are going to have a way easier task to make the position winning. And now at this moment, let's check out what is going on with the black's pieces. First of all, the king is having the contact with the pawn. Good. Second of all, we have two diagonals. We need to take into account what are the length of both of these diagonals. Let's just look at this about the length. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. One of this is 6 squares, the other is 1, 2, 3. And take notice, sometimes one of the diagonal is longer, the other is shorter. And now at this moment, the bishop getting only 3 squares on the diagonal, including the place it is sitting on, is too short. Why? Because the king is having these squares covered, and at the same time, if the bishop step back from this short diagonal, it is not protecting the promoting square. At the same time, our bishop is not allowing the opponent's bishop to get into this diagonal because it's going to be captured. And now at this moment, we are getting the bishop the quite. At this moment, if the bishop is not, let's say, doing anything, we just capture the bishop and then promote. And if the bishop captures, it's no longer protecting the promoting square. We are just making the queen. Queen versus bishop, it's a win. And now what's going on at this position if we have the idea from black's perspective? Because white, of course, as we just saw, had the idea of the deflection from the promoting square control, and at this moment white was winning easily. What would it be if black was to move? Let's check it out. After king c6, black tries to get right here in order to have this square's control. Of course, it's still losing, because at this moment the short diagonal is too short for the defending side, because only 3 squares, and therefore at this moment white wins. And now how white wins? The first idea is to chase away the bishop. Of course, if the bishop captures, we recapture. After stepping back, the pawn promotes, therefore capturing it doesn't make too much sense. After the bishop tries to step back, the bishop gets into the other diagonal, into controlling the square from the other diagonal and having this square covered, otherwise the pawn promotes. And now, after the bishop gets with check, take notice that the bishop of blacks doesn't have the time to control the square, because at some point we can say that white's bishop just simply had a little bit of time to control, to release the promoting square, and after king step back, we are just promoting. Of course, if we get a little bit different idea, we can get this way. After bishop check, take notice that if the king step back as far away as possible, we simply make the interference the way as we just did recently. And if the king gets right here, at this moment there is the Zugzwang. What does it mean? It means if the bishop is not controlling the short diagonal we are promoting, the bishop cannot get magically into the long diagonal to have the square controlled. And at the same time, the king cannot get into these two squares on the diagonal of our bishop. And at this moment, after the Zugzwang gets in, black simply loses. Why is that? Because at this moment, the bishop cannot get into this square because it's going to be captured. The king can only protect the bishop from these squares right here. And of course, at this moment, if the king gets into the square b5, we are trading the bishops and then promoting the pawn. The king cannot get into the diagonal right here. And if the king gets into this stuff, we are just pretty much easily winning because we are attacking the bishop right here, having these squares covered by the king and by the bishop. And again, if the bishop gets away from the short diagonal, we are promoting. If the king gets into b5 square, we are just trading the bishops and winning actually, and then promoting the pawn. Therefore, at this moment, the same position, regardless who is on the move, is winning for the stronger side. And now another position. This time, the pawn is a little bit different let's say square, the king is a little bit different setup as well, and it seems like that the weaker side, the defending side, having the optimal position. Let's check it out, the length of the diagonal in front of the pawn from the promoting square. As we probably can see immediately, the short diagonal is only 2 squares long, or you can say 2 squares short, and the long diagonal is 7 squares long. Therefore, at this moment, the bishop cannot get into the long diagonal. If the bishop steps back from the short diagonal, the pawn immediately promotes. One of the ways, except of the interfering, is just to simply make the bishop decoyed, and after the bishop is decoyed from the promoting of the from the protecting of the promoting squares, it's going to be an easy win. At this moment, as we can see, the bishop is being attacked. Take notice, the king is not protecting the bishop. After the bishop captures, we are promoting. If the bishop is not captured, if the king gets there, we are just either capturing the bishop, either trading the bishop, and then we are just simply promoting the pawn. Therefore, at this moment, if the short diagonal is just two squares long, it is always a loss. And now let's have a look what would happen if this position would be from black's perspective. For example, if black to move, if black is able to draw this position. Previously it was white to play, now black to play. What would be the black's plan? The black's plan would be to try to stay right here, not allowing any trades. And at this moment, even if the king would be staying here, white has the winning plan as well. Therefore, let's check it out. King b5. Now, of course, the decoy is the simplest idea, winning immediately, but let's pretend we are just, let's say, not getting too much into this. After the capture, at this moment, as you can see, this square of the promotion, the king is just covering this at the same time, having the square promotion as the stairway to heaven from the pawn endgames, as probably you may remember. And now, at this moment, it's simply a win. Of course, if the king would be already right here, if we just played bishop f2, it's pretty similar. The bishop cannot capture because the promotion, and if the king would be on the a6 square bishop f2, what you can do with the bishop? If you step back with the bishop on the long diagonal, the pawn promotes, and after the bishop gets f2, you cannot protect the bishop other than getting into the b6 square of the king. Of course, it's illegal. Therefore, even if the black king would be already on the a6 square, regardless who is on the move, still it's a winning position for white. And now another position. Let's have a look about this position, what's going on. Again, the bishop is on the long diagonal. This time the short diagonal is 2 squares long or 2 squares short. And now how can we make this position winning? We are seizing the diagonal, we are just taking the control of the long diagonal, and this way we are winning. After bishop b8, of course, after the capture, king captures, stepping back either way and promoting, it's immediate win. And after bishop gets the other way, the bishop cannot get into the short diagonal because the king is protecting this diagonal. Therefore, after the king step back, the next move is the promotion. Of course, if the bishop gets a7, first capture and then promotion. And now let's check it out what would happen if this position would be from black's perspective. How black could strengthen this position, how can black make this position the best way possible. After king b5, black is trying to get from the other side, then bishop b8 attacking the bishop, trying to decoy the bishop, exchange the bishop, after the bishop gets here, what would it be? Even if the bishop is right there, and now the bishop could be here, it still would be the Zugzwang. Therefore, let's check it out, because of course now winning idea is simply pushing the pawn, but let's give a little bit of chances for black to come back into the game. Bishop f4, and now bishop a7. And now, as I just already said, with the bishop on the short diagonal, it is just 2 squares long, it is always a loss. Why? Because of the simple Zugzwang. At this moment, we are getting on this long diagonal, and again, if the king step back into one of the squares on the 5th rank, we capture the bishop and promote. The bishop cannot get into the b8 because we can capture either with the bishop or the king. And now, if the king gets into the diagonal, we are just making the x-ray, you can call it the skewer, and now simply winning the bishop and the game with the promotion. Now let's check out what would happen at this position, because this position is a little bit different, because take notice that at this moment the king cannot be chased away by our bishop, because the king is sitting on the dark square, whereas we have the light square bishop. And how to win this position? Now at this moment, again, the short diagonal is 3 squares long, the long diagonal is 6 squares long. And now, how to win this position the easiest way? First of all, if the king is not protecting the bishop, the king captures the bishop and pawn promotes. At this moment, what are the squares the king can technically or potentially protect the bishop? These are the squares a6, b6, c6. At this moment, as you probably can spot immediately, c6 square is not available. Therefore, at this moment, if both of these squares would not be available, and if the king needs to step back, the bishop would not be protected. Of course, if the bishop step back from the short diagonal, it's not protecting the promoting square, therefore the pawn promotes immediately. And now after bishop gets into b5, now if the king captures the bishop, we just capture the opponent's bishop, promote. And now what are the other ways? There are no other ways. Because if the king gets into this square or this square protecting the bishop, these are both illegal moves. And now at the same time, if the bishop gets into last rank, capture, stepping back and promotion, and if the bishop gets to a6, we simply trade the bishops and after that promote the pawn up to the queen. Therefore, a winning idea for white. And now another position. This time, this one is pretty difficult, therefore I encourage you to analyze this position at least a few times, because even though it seems pretty simple, but I guess if you do not analyze it a little bit deeper, you may be very confused. First of all, what would it be if white would have a few moves? For example, if white could make this maneuver to challenge the control of the long diagonal from the opponent's bishop, it's going to be the pretty easy win, as we already established. Why? Because the short diagonal is just 2 squares long, the long diagonal is 7 squares long. Therefore, if we just establish the control over long diagonal, we are already winning immediately. And now, what would be the plan? As we just mentioned, the plan is the following: to get the maneuver up to the bishop, to challenge the bishop, to release the control of the long diagonal, and the bishop cannot stay on the short diagonal because black gets into the Zugzwang. And now, after bishop h4, as we already see, the bishop can get into one of these 4 squares. If the bishop gets in front of the pawn, it's going to be captured by the king. And now, we are having 2 ways to defend. The first way would be with the king, the second with the bishop. Let's check it out, the first way with the king. The king tries to sink in to the other side of the board and how white is going to win. Of course, at this moment, the idea is the similar one as we just already established, but at this moment it's not available because if the bishop gets a7, the bishop gets captured and black draws immediately. Therefore, at this moment, bishop c5 seems a little bit like a magical move. Mysterious, magical, call it whatever you wish. And now, at this moment, of course, black needs to have the bishop on the long diagonal to secure the promoting square, sacrificing the bishop when the pawn promotes into the queen, and the bishop needs to get into this diagonal. And now, what's going on? Now we can get into the other, let's say, a way for getting into the control for the long diagonal, not from the previous idea from this maneuver and getting the bishop up to the square b8, but now this way we are getting into the bishop to c7 to regain the control over the long diagonal. And now what's going on? The bishop gets e7, d8, c7, and now if the king tries to step back right here to have the control over the square e7, it seems like that first of all it's a check, second of all now this square is control, it seems like that white doesn't do anything. But now it's a very powerful idea because we have the so-called powerful move. As we can see, this is the so-called decoy. At the same time, if the bishop is captured, the pawn promotes, and this decoy gives us the time to make the bishop into this square b8 with this maneuver as we established at the first place. After the bishop step back, now the bishop gets there, the king is not a6 already, therefore after the king tries to get there, not allowing the bishop to get here, now the bishop is a little bit faster, and now at this moment we regained the control over the long diagonal and we are winning. After the bishop step back, we are going here. The only way to stop the bishop from stop the pawn from promoting is to getting the bishop to a7. After bishop a7, of course, we cannot push the pawn immediately as it ends in a draw, but we are just making the decoy, and now the bishop cannot stay on this diagonal. After the bishop is captured right here, we are promoting, and if the bishop captures our bishop, the pawn promotes, we are winning. Therefore, at this moment, I encourage you to replay this position a few times, because it is not so easy as it seems like. Of course, it was the first idea, as we just established that this would be the plan of regaining the control over the long diagonal, and with the king trying not to allow for this, with the idea of king b5 a6 or king b6 a6 controlling a7 square, not allowing our bishop to get there. What would it be if the bishop, after the bishop getting h4, would stay on the diagonal and the king will not move anywhere? This is the second defense. Let's check it out. What's going on? Now, of course, we are having the same idea as previously, and now let's check it out, how it makes the change of the result. At this moment, as we already see, if the bishop captures the bishop, it's immediate loss for black. And now at this moment, again, if the bishop gets into the short diagonal, they are not going to stay on with the bishop on this diagonal, because the diagonal is too short. At the same time, the king is not protecting the bishop. Even if it was, we are just recapturing the bishop, trading the bishops, and making the promotion of the pawn immediately. Therefore, at this moment, I would say that if the bishop is stepping back on these squares f4, e5, d6, or c7, with the bishop getting into this diagonal, controlling the promoting square, we are immediately making this plan, and probably this is the simplest. And if the king gets right here, it gets a little bit more moves to make. But either way, it's a winning endgame. And now, guys, we are just having the first ideas discussed, and I guess if you just replay some of these positions step by step and learn these ideas, I hope you will learn the basics. At the next episode, we'll be looking at more of these examples and more ideas, and I hope that you will be enjoying the endgames and learning together with me. If you have any comments or any questions, put them in the comments. I'll try to address them. Thank you very much, and let's get into the next episode soon.